Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from WISPolitics.com and WISPbusiness.com. Thanks very much for joining us today for a WISPolitics.com La Follette School of Public Affairs virtual luncheon on the top election issues. We're about 1 month away from the election. Of course, people are already voting and the vote counting will probably go on a bit, I guess. But I think, media often talk and focus about the horse race. I think what we want to focus on today are the top issues and how they will affect voters after the election. So we have a really great slate of La Follette experts here today. I want to thank the La Follette School for helping to put this together, and I want to thank these experts. First of all, we have Menzie Chinn, who's going to talk about the economy. Geoffrey Wallace, who's going to talk about racial justice and inequities. Greg Nemet, who's going to talk about climate change. And Christine Durrance, who's going to talk about healthcare. I want to also, before we get into the discussion, talk about some upcoming events at WISPolitics.com that we're part of. You can do one of these on Tuesday. We'll have a virtual luncheon in cooperation with the Milwaukee Press Club and that involves the Milwaukee Election Commission, and the guest will be Claire Woodall-Bogg. And then on October 8th and 9th, we have our second annual Midwest Polling Summit. You can find out information on that at WISPolitics.com, but that'll take place over the noon hour on October 8th and 9th. That's next week. Then October 15th, we have the state Senate leaders are going to be talking about the top Senate races. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about the top election issues. I want to make sure I thank the sponsors for this event series: Hush Blackwell, American Family Insurance, Walmart, Xcel Energy, ARP Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Hospital Association. The way this format works, I ask questions of our guests, and then we'll bring in questions from you, the audience members. You can, some of you have submitted questions in advance, and that's great. If something moves you to ask another question, or for somebody who didn't ask a question, you can go to the Q&A function at the bottom there and type in your question, and they'll all flow through me. So I want to go first, since there is actual news today. We have an October surprise. It's only October 2nd, but the October surprise is about the healthcare issue. So I want to bring in Professor Christine Durrance. Christine, why don't you first of all tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Jeff, for having me. It's a pleasure to participate in this forum. I'm looking forward to the discussion and from hearing from my colleagues as well. I am an associate professor in the La Follette School of Public Affairs here at UW-Madison. I am a new hire to the school. I just joined UW-Madison after 13 years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Department of Public Policy. I'm an economist by training, and I think a lot about health economics and health policy topics with some specific focus areas in maternal and reproductive and infant health, as well as risky behavior topics like substance use and the opioid crisis. I'm currently teaching an undergraduate course in health policy that's called Contemporary Issues in Health Policy. So my students and I are talking about some of these exact issues that I imagine we may talk about today. And so I'm happy to provide some thoughts on healthcare in the upcoming election.
Okay, well, healthcare, amidst the noise, there was a talk about healthcare, the ACA, and the Supreme Court nomination on Tuesday night in that presidential debate. And then early this morning or late last night, depending upon where you are in the world, you find out that the First Lady and President have tested positive coronavirus. Reports are now saying that President Trump is experiencing mild symptoms, but he's seen a lot of people in the meantime. Democratic nominee Joe Biden, I guess, just tested negative. So, okay, given all that, what does that say to you about your big issue, healthcare, and how that's going to play over the next month with voters?
I think that's a great question. And I probably, like many of you, woke up to this news and have been drinking from the news fire hose this morning about who is tested positive and who is tested negative. So I think there are myriad concerns right now for the president's health, the health of the first lady, anyone that he or she may have interacted with recently, the administration of his presidential duties, and most importantly, how we might think this is going to impact the next couple of weeks before the election. This will certainly impact public appearances and campaign rallies and any future debates that we may have been looking to see. I think that healthcare is front and center at the 2020 election this year. And I think that there are probably many ways that healthcare is front and center in our election this year, but I think there are three big ones. One is the way in which we are all situated in the COVID-19 pandemic, which has sort of begun as a public health crisis, but has spilled over into a crisis in so many other dimensions, including the labor market, all levels of education, childcare, et cetera. The other big ways I think healthcare is important in the 2020 election is through our continuing conversations about health insurance and healthcare costs. And in particular, that's wrapped up in the COVID-19 pandemic as well, where many individuals in the United States have health insurance through their employer, and millions of Americans have lost jobs as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has also meant loss of healthcare. The third big reason that I think, or the third big factor that I think is at play here in the 2020 election is with the decision over the Supreme Court nominee. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments about the ACA, and I think that will be a big factor in the election discussion this year as well.
Yes, and also you mentioned that part of your course of study is about reproductive rights, and certainly the new Supreme Court nominee, is, I guess there's revelations about her signing on to an anti-abortion ad, and then that puts Roe v. Wade in danger. And so maybe talk a little bit about that and the ACA and the whole Supreme Court thing, about how that, could play out for years to come, I guess.
Sure. So I think the first part of this is with the case that we know that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear, which is about the ACA. So the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a challenge to the ACA. Texas and a number of other states, attorneys general and a couple governors have filed litigation alleging that the individual mandate, which was part of the ACA in its origins, the individual mandate would have required every American to have health insurance or face a penalty. That penalty went to zero in 2017 with a decision by Congress. The actions by Texas and the other states involved in the litigation are challenging the individual mandate as unconstitutional. So the decision that the Supreme Court will be faced with early November is whether or not that individual mandate is indeed unconstitutional, and if so, what other parts of the ACA are connected to it which could potentially fall as well. So there's an issue of separability, whether or not the whole law falls if the individual mandate is found to be unconstitutional. There's a lot of things in the ACA, so just to remind our viewers, this would mean if the whole law was negatively affected by a finding of the individual mandates, if we found it to be unconstitutional, this would mean things like prohibitions on pre-existing conditions, young people being able to stay on their parents' insurance until they're 26, Medicaid expansion, subsidies for premiums in the individual health insurance market, preventative cost sharing that's currently at zero, coverage for contraceptives that's currently at $0 in cost sharing. So it could mean big impacts for a lot of people, both in terms of the types of access to healthcare that we have, but also in terms of the millions of people who have gained health insurance coverage from the ACA.
Right. I dare say that if they took a vote in Congress on the pre-existing conditions and the kids till 26, that would probably pass unanimously. The rest of it is very partisanized. So we'll come back to you a little bit later, Professor Durance. Thanks very much. Now, I haven't ordered these in the order of my importance of these. I think that I'm just doing it as a matter of convenience. I'm not elevating one issue over another. They're all important. But we're going to go to Professor Chinn now. We're going to talk about the economy, obviously a big COVID issue. But first, Professor Chinn, just introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your academic interests.
Hi, Jeff, and thanks for having me on. It's a great opportunity. Let me, particularly at these times, I'm a professor of public affairs and economics at Follette and in the economics department here at UW-Madison. Previously, I've done some work in the government. I was in the White House Council of Economic Advisors staff back 2000, 2001 under Clinton and then Bush. Since then, I've been a sort of a visiting scholar at the Congressional Budget Office and IMF, Federal Reserve. My areas of research are sort of international macroeconomics. And so here at Follette in the econ department, I teach, right now I'm teaching macroeconomic policy, clearly relevant. And then last semester at Follette, I was teaching trade policy. So let me just say, it's been a busy year or so, actually 3 years, particularly with trade policy. So those are my areas of research.
Too bad there's nothing for you to talk about. Anyway, the COVID's impact on the economy, shutdowns and healthcare disruptions at work and all these things, the economy seems to be bouncing back, although, maybe the unemployed is undercounted. But anyway, how do you see this? What's your view on how this is going to affect voters and, and maybe how the COVID thing will play out in terms of the economy?
Okay, well, that's a great set of questions. Let me just first say that the most important thing to remember about this crisis or this recession is that it's inextricably linking together the economy and the healthcare and public health crisis. So the fact is, a lot of people will say, well, we seem to be coming back maybe more slowly than we thought. But what the information that we got yesterday and today confirms is that the recovery is slowing. I mean, today what we had was 661,000 net new jobs being announced for roughly mid-September occurring. Well, you say, well, that's a big plus, big number, but we're down we were down 20 million jobs. And even now, we're down 7% number of jobs relative to February of this year. So think about how much has just occurred in just the past 6-7 months. We also see a whole bunch of other indicators that are indicating the economy is slowing down. Now, why? Well, part of it is the shutdown was voluntary, but part of it is that there's this sort of feedback loop between the public health crisis and the economy. That is, we had this sort of let's just get it done quickly, get it over with approach to opening up the economy, trying to ignore the fact that you would have a resurgence in cases if you opened up certain sectors of the economy rapidly. So what do we have? We have sort of this opening up and then closing down parts and then opening up and then closing down, things going in fits and starts. And so those who argued that we would have a V-shaped recovery were essentially dreaming. I mean, I think that's my opinion is, and many people were dreaming that we could just ignore the consequences of the pandemic and just barrel ahead. So, if you think things were okay, my point would be in some ways, we've just experienced the best of times. Hard to believe, but yes, because the federal government responded with a great deal of alacrity with trillions of dollars worth of support. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates all the way to zero and opened up all these sort of special facilities. That kept the economy and people's budgets going through the summer. But now we have gridlock again, apparently. And so there's no more money coming, even as the other programs have expired, the enhanced unemployment benefits, the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which kept businesses afloat. Those things are running out or have run out exactly as the economy's growth is slowing down. And on top of that, you put on this layer of uncertainty in terms of whether there'll be another recovery package to extend the support for family incomes and for businesses. Even just Disneyland and the airlines together are sort of harbingers of really big things to come unless action is taken. So the first thing to take away from this is we're not out of the woods. Some people will crow about 7.9% unemployment. We're down from somewhere around 12. But actually, if you count things in a way which was consistent with before the COVID crisis, taking into account misclassification, it's closer to 9.6 percentage points of unemployment. Okay, that's the first point. Second point is, I would say that that makes the choice that we're confronting going forward even bigger because the biggest challenges are in the future to prevent the scarring of the economy because you have high persistent unemployment. So who gets into office come January 20th is going to have a big impact on the evolution of the economy going forward. Did you have a question about?
Yeah, I was going to say there was one of the Fed governors, I think, said the other day that we're probably the recovery where we were pre-pandemic would be like 3 or 4 years.
Depending upon which metric you use. So I think the consensus is 2022 first half GDP gets back to where it would have otherwise been. Okay, even at the end of this year with this rapid recovery so far, we're going to be, by all accounts, something like 4%, 5% below where we were at the end of last year. If you think about it, we grow about 2% each year on average. So we're like 6%, despite the trillions, let me just say trillions of dollars that have already been thrown in to support the economy. So we have tremendous challenges ahead. And I'm afraid that the lessons from the last recession and recovery are going to be forgotten. And the biggest lesson was don't withdraw the stimulus too quickly. The states are in a bad way. The shortfalls of something on the order of 500 billion over the next 2 years. One party in the Congress refuses to give a lot of assistance to the states and localities. What will that mean? States and localities will have to ratchet back spending and employment and so forth. And that's just like a self-inflicted harm that's going to ensure the recovery is long, prolonged, and not as vigorous as it could be. At the same time, hurting those people who rely upon those services the most.
Right. So your message is no time for austerity. So now I'm going to move on to Professor Gregory Nemet, whose specialty is climate. And I guess you're high atop the Van Heist building is what people tell me. No, you just got a good virtual backdrop. You're a little more advanced than the rest of us. Anyway, Professor Nemet, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So yeah, people love this picture, especially from outside Madison that don't know it, are like, wow, what is that place? Yeah. So I'm a professor of public affairs at the Follette School of Public Affairs. I teach courses in policy analysis, and I'm currently teaching a course on energy policy. And I'm also actively engaged in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's an international body whose job is to provide scientific and objective advice to the United Nations to help with international climate negotiations. And my basic take on climate and the election is that this is a different issue because it's inherently long-term. A lot of things are moving in the right direction, but we need to make them move faster and have these solutions move to scale. And that's really the challenge of our age. And finally, that voters care. So, just to kind of put a little bit behind each of those points, the technologies that we might need for climate change, will need for climate change, are getting better despite 30 years of dithering on this issue. I mean, I've been working, I was up early and almost most days this week talking to people about what's going to be the main headlines out of this next UN report, and this notion that's been a surprise that renewable energy and electric vehicles and the batteries that power them have gotten so much better and cheaper beyond what even experts thought they would get. That's making these solutions more feasible, more affordable to actually deal with climate change. And I think importantly, it also makes local action far more effective than it would have been in the past, because instead of cities having to come up with a brand new solution, there's solutions now, whether it's electrification of transportation fleets or insulation and things like that, that are not out of reach of communities. And so local action is now affordable. And also there's local benefits that come from that, whether it's employment, whether it's companies that find new lines of business, and then some of the co-benefits that are near-term and local, like the health benefits of lower air pollution. And then finally, you know, it's pretty striking, first, that I'm even on this panel. It's because voters care about this issue in a way that they haven't in the past, and the polling really reflects that. So we've got like 73% of people, regardless of party, say that climate change is an issue. A little bit less than that, like 68%, say the government's not doing enough on it. And then probably most crucially, there's about 25% of people that are polled that say that climate change is an extremely important issue to them. And there's sometimes what's called an issue public. And that's a polling level that's a little bit below abortion and a little bit above gun control. So there's a group of people out there that could potentially be very motivated and very activated to bring this issue and raise it. And so I think that's why there's more discussion about it. Like, it wasn't supposed to be in the first debate, but it did come up in the first debate. And I think that's something that's really changed.
Okay, great segue, because I'm going to ask about the first debate. If you have, amid the noise and you're able to hang on a little bit, there was a discussion about a discussion. Maybe there were talking points aired on about climate change. But there was this talk about the AOC plan versus, and I think Joe Biden wanted to stress that it was the Biden plan. And I don't want to get too deep. I'm not trying to get you to endorse a plan. I'm just trying to say, what should we take out of, it's not the AOC plan, it's the Biden plan. What should we take out of that?
So, I mean, one thing that's really, first thing to say is that candidates have really distinct positions on this issue. So there's no confusion about that. And then second, in terms of the Biden plan, like, you know, in the debate, he said that he's not for the Green New Deal, but it's on his website that he does talk about the Green New Deal. But it's the distinction he was trying to make was between that proposed by AOC and Elizabeth Warren and that of his own plan that has some, you know, differences in how it works. But the overall take there is that climate change is such a big issue that it's not just about kind of patching up the incentives and fixing the policies that lead to the wrong decisions that we have today that lead to more pollution, that we're talking about transformation, we're talking about equity and racial issues too, and that potentially what we need is a bigger all-encompassing plan, and that's what the idea of a Green New Deal is about, and is part of Biden's platform, even if there are distinctions between what he's suggesting and what AOC and Elizabeth Warren originally suggested with the Green New Deal. It's also something that's already happening in other places, like Korea has already announced its Green Deal, and the European Union has a plan to have its COVID recovery include a lot of funding for clean energy and climate change. So, you know, there's models that we can take from other places, but that is a big part of the Biden climate platform too, is to have this climate plan that goes beyond just about making less pollution and enabling the transition and making equity and racial justice part of that plan as well.
Right. The thing about climate is that it affects the economy and healthcare, and now it affects what we're going to talk about now with Professor Wallace, racial inequities. Professor Wallace, thanks very much for being with us. Last but not least, introducing you and your topic of racial justice and inequities. First off, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your course of study.
Yeah, so my name is Geoffrey Wallace. I'm an associate professor of economics and public affairs at the Follette School and also in the Department of Economics. I'm sort of unique among the Follette faculty in that I'm actually from Wisconsin. So I was born and raised in Milwaukee. I spent a little bit of time in the Chicago area, and then I moved here for employment. I study inequality, poverty, and social policy, but I also dabble a little bit in health and health economics. My teaching for this semester is very focused on inequality and social policy. I'm teaching a course for La Follette called Race, Inequality, and Public Policy, and another for economics called Poverty, Inequality, and the Economics of Poverty and Inequality. So I've been thinking a lot about how the current situation affects poverty and inequality, and I just want to say that we were doing really good. So for folks that don't know this, we're always sort of a year behind on poverty. So we just recently, in mid-September, got 2019 numbers, and they looked out of sight. They looked great. We're down to a 10.5% national poverty rate, and that's the lowest that we've been since they started measuring these things. I've kind of historically in my classes said that child poverty in the US is about 20%. That's no longer true. We're below 15% for 2019 for child poverty. And if I want to emphasize something, it's that we really do get these reductions in poverty when we can have long sustained economic recoveries like we had at the end of the century, the 20th century, and like we just sort of wrapped up as of February. So I'm very concerned about what's going to happen in the future. I think we can expect to see much higher poverty rates next year. I don't want to speculate, but this is going to be something close to catastrophic. And it's spilling out into all sorts of other areas as well. We're seeing record levels of food insecurity, and that's among adults, and adults usually feed themselves first. So it's undoubtedly higher in households with children, or spilling over into households with children. And we're also seeing a looming eviction crisis. So there's like 25% of non-Hispanic Black Americans, for example, that are behind at least a month on the rent. So those are the sort of things that have been on my mind.
Right, and I just want to follow up on that. It seems like the COVID crisis has, the economy has hurt a stratified society. Education, the way education is unfolding for many is stratified. The people who are hurting are going to get less, or not have all the resources. It's just sort of like you're making so much progress, like you said, and now comes all these things, and it seems to be affecting people without means a lot more, and not to mention the COVID deaths and COVID illnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. As a faculty member at a university, it hasn't affected me yet, but it has affected people that are in the bottom parts of the earnings distribution much more. That's where the job losses have been concentrated, also on racial and ethnic minorities. And these things have far-reaching implications. We're losing jobs that aren't going to come back. We're losing jobs in parts of the country that aren't going to come back. I think about places like Las Vegas or Disney World. I mean, Las Vegas, I don't think it's going to be what it was. We have a tremendous problem there. How are we going to resort workers to jobs where they're productive? It's really catastrophic. And I'll just say about the things like eviction crisis and hunger and things like that. That has long-lasting implications. That affects subsequent health outcomes. It affects subsequent labor market outcomes when those kids grow up. There's research that shows that if you're born in a recession, you have increased risk of dying before your first birth. If you come of age during a bad recession, like the one in the early 80s, you have lower labor market performance throughout your life. You have increased risk of chronic health conditions and all sorts of things. So this is stuff that we're not just living with today, but it's going to affect our future in pretty dramatic ways, I think, at least for some of our population.
Okay, we're going to go to some question and answers from the audience. And if, again, you didn't submit a question when you registered, if you want to go to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and submit a question, we'll try to get them in. And I may combine questions for a more general purpose of this discussion. So I'm going to combine a couple. Somebody asked a question about misinformation and information overload and the weaponizing information for political purposes. And then somebody asked how to best inform low information voters. You know, you folks are in the, you know, you deal with facts and research, and it must be disconcerting at times to see all these things turned around. And so how do you relay information? And you can take some pot shots at media too. That's okay. You're not going to hurt my feelings. But what's going on? How can we fight misinformation and the weaponization of this for politics? Or maybe we can't. Why don't we just start off with Professor Nemet, and we'll sort of work backwards on that.
Yeah, I mean, with climate change, this is not at all a new issue. I mean, this is something where some of the same people that were working against tobacco legislation in the 70s and the 80s, you know, some of the same lawyers and lobbyists and advocates started working for the same thing to oppose regulation for climate change beginning in the late 1980s. But yeah, lately, you know, there's been new channels for that information, and it's certainly a big issue. I mean, I think it's an issue that a question in the debate was really about whether one of the candidates believed that climate change was happening. I don't feel like that's a helpful question for voters to find information about where their candidate stands on that. It's much more about where the solutions are. I think the issue that I guess I come down on it is that even if you did have well-informed voters about climate change, that doesn't mean that they'd be very motivated to vote for people or to do something about it. I mean, there are aspects of climate change that are extremely discouraging and disheartening. And there's also, you know, I pay attention to some of the communications research that shows that that doesn't tend to activate people. That activates a small number of people, maybe scientists or people that are already invested in that area. But for most people, they're looking more for a vision and a set of solutions. And I think so as that type of information becomes more obvious and more available, I think that is probably one of the most important ways of getting from low information voters to become higher information voters, is to think about some of the real solutions that could work in their community that help for climate change, but also help about local things like employment and near-term local health benefits as well.
Yeah, just on climate change, though, it's sort of like it was for many, it was an esoteric discussion, right? It's such long term. But then, you know, I think the discussion on hurricanes and wildfires or flooding in the Midwest when it occurs or whatever, it brings to, I think it helps localize, it helps people understand it better. And I think that brings it out of the, you know, out of the world of academics or theoreticians, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, those near-term real impacts that are happening are, yeah, I think people do react to that.
Okay, Professor Chinn, you know, there's no doubt that, you know, economic data is often twisted up for political purposes. I mean, you must have heard some of that in the debate, you know, about job stats, and, you know, the fact checkers had a field day. But what's your opinion on how to fight misinformation and how to maybe reach low information voters with the right data?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I have to say I'm completely befuddled by this question. I mean, you know, what's true is that economic discourse has gravitated a long ways away from when I was a graduate student, where there were a few people who wrote in newspapers on economics who were not economists by and large in terms of their training. And then there was a whole set of people in academia who spoke to each other. And since then, you know, we've had all these sorts of things move into sort of brief statements on paper. Then we moved to blogs, and then on to now Twitter is as far as I can see, an incredibly active area for academics to engage each other on both policy and on research. And so the information is circulating, and yet there seems to be tremendous self-selection in terms of what you consume. And that's the problem. Unless you can get people to move away from what they're attuned to, you know, the group, whatever platform they've been paying attention to, and the people they're following, it's going to be hard to get through the fact that, yes, 30 years, 40, 50 years of research says that tax cuts don't typically pay for themselves. They may be good ideas for other reasons, but they don't pay for themselves. And yet you see this thing pop up over and over again, despite repeated episodes where it fails to occur. So how do you break through? I guess all we can do as academics is to continue to engage in the popular platforms. And then when somebody says something that's so egregious, like the chief economic spokesman says, we've got a V-shaped recovery, and everybody can see it's pretty much not a V-shaped recovery. We're not back to where we were at the end of 2019. That's about the only time, it's analogous to Greg's statement about real life events come in and hit people. And then you conjoin it with, well, yes, we knew that. That's what all the research said. That's about the only time you can see that research breaks into the low income, low information voter, I'm afraid.
Okay, Professor Durance, I mean, healthcare, highly politicized, so a lot of it gets twisted up. What about the fighting through misinformation? What can voters do to fight through misinformation, and how can some of that be relayed to what we call low information voters?
I'm not sure I have solutions for this. I just have some thoughts. And that is that so much of what we're seeing in the media these days around any topic, including the COVID-19 pandemic, is highly polarized. And I think what we want to communicate to voters generally is to rely on the science and to try to avoid focusing on how the COVID-19 pandemic is being politicized in terms of the information that's being provided, in terms of statistics on COVID cases or accuracy of testing, mask wearing. Many elements of this pandemic have really been subject to political debate rather than a focus on the science. And so I think that's where I'll leave it. We should focus on the science.
Okay, Professor Wallace, what about, low information voters that, sometimes those are people in poverty because, they're struggling day to day to get by. They don't have time to study issues. What about getting information to, those kind of folks?
Well, they're having a lived experience, so I worry a little bit less about people that are low income knowing something about being low income and social policy. I worry more about the general population writ large. I think this is an area, social policy, that's gotten really politicized, and somewhere in the background or in the forefront of it, race becomes an issue, and it's an issue that's gotten really racialized. If we mention something like welfare, the first thing that pops up in a lot of people's minds are Black people. And that's just the reality of it, and that affects the politics of it. It affects what we can do. And so I don't really have any good answers. I mean, I try and provide clarity on these issues when I have an opportunity to, but I'm not always sure that it's doing much good. We're in a sort of environment where people get to pick what information they want to consume. And a lot of times they just end up selecting the information that comports with their priors or that supports their values and beliefs. And that doesn't really do anybody any good. And so if I could just get this one thing out to the audience, and it has to do with the word welfare. What does that mean? Well, I mean, traditionally we've talked about welfare and it had something to do with cash benefit programs, traditionally for single parent families. And I just want to emphasize that that's not something that we do to a great extent anymore. We don't just give people cash grants. We have like 1 million people, 1 million families maybe on the successor to the AFDC program, which are state TANF programs. And primarily the way that we assist people today is we provide them with in-kind transfers, so things like housing assistance or food stamps, SNAP, or we provide them with refundable tax credits. But those only go to families that work. So we're not, the sort of people that are being left out are people who don't have a lot of labor market earnings.
Okay, well, there's another question, a set of questions that have popped up about, the stimulus checks. And, Andrew Yang ran a campaign. One of his main issues was on guaranteed income, some level of guaranteed income, which is, I guess, experiencing kind of a boomlet in terms of the discussion. But Professor Chinn, are direct stimulus payments, guaranteed income, does that work?
So I must confess, this is my primary area of research, and I think there's this longer term issue of automation and displacement of workers in certain sectors, and how you guarantee that people get a income over time so they can do planning and sustain themselves. I'll talk about the cyclical aspect. I mean, it worked. I mean, we dumped $1 trillion odd worth of just sort of payments and enhanced unemployment benefits to people who had to be furloughed or let go for several months, and that sustained the economy, and that reduced hardship. So it works in that sense. And don't forget, we gave essentially $1 trillion odd to firms as well, to keep them in business, because we understood that if firms went out of business, you destroy whole networks of relationships that aren't easily just replaced, as they would be in the simple economic model that you learn in a textbook. So to that extent, those things work, and they have worked, but they're petering out now. I guess the thing that goes on the other side is, what's the cost? The cost is you accumulate debt. I mean, you need to engage in big deficits. They would have been smaller deficits if we hadn't given massive tax cuts back in 2017-18 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Like we would have a deficit that would, debt maybe $1 trillion odd less, but here we are where we are. The benefit, I guess, or the positive thing is to say that interest rates are unnaturally low in some senses. So the real cost to the federal government of borrowing at this moment is pretty close to zero. And if it's not exactly zero, it's been as low as it's ever been on a continuous basis in the US. So I would say at the moment, you want to err on trying to support people's incomes, trying to maintain businesses from disappearing, as they are likely to do regardless of what you're going to do in the next few months. Bankruptcies are going to shoot up. They're probably already shooting up. I think those things are things that you want to do because you don't want the long-term effects to be ingrained in the system. You don't want people to be out of the labor force for a tremendous amount of time, and you don't want lots and lots of firms to disappear that otherwise wouldn't.
Okay, I want to go to Professor Nemet. There's a lot of questions here about relating to the economics of climate and energy. As you said, renewables have become a lot cheaper and rival natural gas in terms of being competitive. But is there still a need for a carbon tax? Or is a carbon tax still would a carbon tax still be an effective strategy?
I think a carbon tax would be really helpful. And, what we're talking about here is a long-term effort to decarbonize our economy over the next few decades. And that means a lot of things have to change. It's helpful to have cheap wind, cheap solar, and now cheap batteries. That makes a lot of things possible that were almost impossible just 10 years ago. And because of that, without a carbon tax, we've got coal plants shutting down that 10 years ago, no one would have ever guessed that the US would shut down a quarter of its coal power plants without a climate policy. And we've got 5 big plants shutting down in Wisconsin. So it's happening here too. And it's partly because of the drivers that you talked about in your question. But eventually we're going to need to decarbonize parts of the economy that are harder to do. And it would really help to have a price on the emissions from those places. And I think one of the ways to think about a carbon price is how it gets internalized in decision making. So it's not so much that we've got a policy at the federal level or at the state level and people see there's a price or a tax. It's to think about companies that when they make a decision about what kind of power plant do they build, where they start to say, okay, and then for the pollution that comes out of that plant for the next 20 years, we're going to pay $50 for every ton of pollution. And that just goes on their financial statements like they do for paying workers and for paying for supplies and things like that. And that's what a carbon tax does that's really effective. And I think what's starting to happen is seeing companies and maybe even regulatory agencies too start to create their own, what might be like a shadow carbon price, so that they start making decisions ahead of time so that they're not making investments now that 10 years in the future they're going to regret, and that they're going to call stranded assets because, oh wait, now we have to decarbonize. So getting ahead of things is a really important strategy for regulatory agencies, for companies, and probably for states, anticipating that there might be federal policy sometime in the future so that we don't get stuck with this carbon intensive infrastructure that's no longer able to be used. And I think that's probably where the state could probably do a much more kind of proactive role.
Okay, I'm going to group in a couple questions now. I think that would best be for Professor Durance and Professor Wallace about the uninsured and healthcare, and whether the public option is the answer or expanded Medicaid is the answer, and what if those go away? Let's just start with you, Professor Wallace, first in terms of healthcare for those in poverty.
Well, most people that are poor would be covered under Medicaid. The exception to that would be some childless individuals in states that didn't take the expansion. They fall into sort of a hole. So that's sort of the low income population. Of course, some folks would be eligible if they have a little higher incomes for ACA premium subsidies as well. I've been thinking a lot about this Supreme Court case and wondering what happens if the court should decide to knock out large parts of the ACA. And, you know, that would really be breaking a healthcare system which is not on super solid ground right now in the middle of a pandemic. I wonder if the court would take that sort of step, but if they do, they really broke something and it's going to need a fix. And if you can't have a sort of market-based plan like the ACA to fix it, well, you're going to have something more intrusive, and it's going to look something more akin to Medicare for all. So that's just my pure speculation.
Okay, Professor Durance, what about public option as an answer? I think that Joe Biden is pushing that.
I think we're still learning a little bit about Joe Biden's plan for the public option and who exactly that would be made available to, and who that would impact. I think the current details suggest that that public option would be available to anyone who's uninsured, including the folks that Professor Wallace was talking about, who are not getting Medicare in their states because those states Medicaid did not expand Medicaid. So I think we're talking about individuals who are currently uninsured, who may be eligible for Medicaid in a state if they expanded it. But I think Joe Biden's plan also includes sort of expanding the ACA and strengthening it in ways that would improve the subsidies that are available to individuals who are eligible for the subsidies but are at higher incomes than those who would be eligible for Medicaid. And so I think it's those pieces together that could potentially reduce the number of Americans that are uninsured.
Okay, let me ask a general question for all of you. You know, you have your issues, your issue expertise, and we've talked about sort of the major points of the issues, but what in your issue area isn't getting the attention that it should? You know, nobody's talking about it, but boy, we should be talking about this. Let's start with Professor Wallace. What's missing in the public discourse?
I mean, I think the things that I mentioned at the outset, which is, you know, the tanking economy and how that's and how that collapse is spread unevenly across the income distribution, the earnings distribution, how it's affected low-income people more, and the sort of crisis that we have in evictions, in hunger or food insecurity, and in rising poverty. I think these are going to be, maybe they're not election issues because they're not getting talked about a whole lot, but they are definitely issues that are going to be with us this year, next year, and for the foreseeable future. I mean, we could spend 15 years before we see a poverty rate at 10.5% again.
Right, and a lot of the nonprofits that were taking care of these things are reeling out of this pandemic economy, right?
Yeah, they are. And also I would just say that we don't really have a safety net that's super equipped to deal with this situation. And the reason for that is that we don't have lots of benefits or ways to provide people with benefits to help meet their basic needs for people that don't have lots of earned income. So our largest means tested transfer program for able-bodied people right now is the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I don't know how much the audience knows about that, but it's essentially a wage subsidy that operates through the tax system. So you don't get anything from that program if you don't work. And if you do work, you can get a subsidy of 40 to 50% of your earnings up to, I don't know, we'll say like the middle teens. You get to keep that for a little while and then we tax it back. So that's really providing benefits to people with incomes around the poverty threshold and maybe a little bit above the poverty threshold. We don't have good ways to boost incomes for people at the very bottom. Really the only program that we have right now that provides benefits to people that don't have earned income is SNAP, and or food stamps as it was known. And I mean, that's just it. And maybe, you know, if you're a family of four, you can get a maximum of like $600 and some of food stamps a month, but that's it. In terms of housing programs, we have lots of people with housing insecurities, lots of people that are paying more than a third of their income in rent. But we really, there's lots of unmet need with these programs. We're helping some people, but there's lots of people that need help that aren't getting it. So these are the issues I don't think are getting a lot of attention.
Right. Professor Chinn, I mean, what issues should we be talking about the economy? What are we missing?
Well, I think the key thing is that well, there's this belief that once we get a vaccine, that largely our problems will be over. And if we do get an effective vaccine, let's say in the middle of next year, being distributed widely, it's true, a lot of our problems will be over, but there will be still enormous long-standing problems that make it such that the stakes for this election are incredibly high. It's clear, I mean, lots of people's savings are going to be wiped out by the time we get to something closer to normal. You know, when you ask, when will unemployment, for instance, unemployment rates reach where they were before the crisis, it's usually outside of the analysts' forecast horizon. Think about that. They're not even saying when they think they'll get back to the unemployment rates we saw before the crisis. It's going to be years of tough slogging, and that's just at the aggregate level, not taking into account the distributional effects. Who's getting hit disproportionately hard, even more so than in a regular recession. So, no, you have to ask who is, you know, what plan is there, depending upon the president, to remedy or to mitigate these problems? What will stimulate the economy more effectively and remedy these distributional issues? And so there are a number of studies that talk about what's going to be the spending trajectory, what's going to be the taxes that are going to be raised on whom. And so I think voters should think about that and not just assume this is a short-standing problem. It's leaving ramifications that are going to be very long-standing, as Geoffrey mentioned. So
did you want to say something, Professor Wallace?
I wanted to ask Menzie a question, and I wanted to ask.
Oh, you want to take over my job?
No, I just had a question, and it's popped up, but I was wondering what parallels he sees between today and 1932.
Well, that's an excellent question. In 1932, I don't think there was an understanding of the way the macroeconomy worked, and macroeconomics was developed in response partly to that experience. We know what should be done, I think, intellectually in most economists. I'm going to characterize it that way. But the political will is not there because, you know, some people believe that, you know, austerity, self-reliance is going to get us out of the hole, and you know, some direction in planning is not the way to go. So in that respect, the failure of there being a big consensus that you need to engage in some planning of some nature with respect to spending, that lack of will is still there, and that's the commonality, and that's what I'm afraid of.
Thank you, Professor Wallace. You'll be able to lead the discussion next time we do this. This is good. we'll have one less face on this screen. Okay, Professor, but before I go to Professor Nemet, though, I want to say the thing that worries me is the toll that this is all taking on small businesses. I don't think we understand the carnage that's going to take place there, and not just at State Street because of, you know, rolling issues on State Street. I'm just saying the carnage on a small business, which probably don't have a lot of savings to begin with. We're not going to know the toll on that for a while. Okay, Professor Nemet, what are we missing from your issue area? What's missing in the discussion we should really be talking about?
I think with climate change, it's sometimes still framed as a trade-off between economic growth and the environment. And that's exactly how President Trump responded to the Green New Deal in the debate on Tuesday night, talking about how much it would cost. And I think what's missing are the opportunities that come from making that transition in terms of employment, in terms of opportunities for companies, and in terms of reduced hospitalizations for kids not going to the hospital from having asthma attacks because of air pollution. And so I think, you know, those benefits and the potential for stimulus that would allow us to go in that direction that's a new way of thinking about climate that hasn't been the way we've talked about it in the past, where it used to be considered a luxury good. It's something that polled really highly when the economy was doing well and unemployment was really low. And now that we have an economy that's struggling and unemployment really high, you've got climate change really high also, and that's really new. And I think that's an important thing for people to appreciate.
Okay, so Professor Durance, what's missing? I mean, the healthcare discussion is so mind-boggling sometimes, but I mean, what are we missing that, you know, what's the big issue we're not talking about?
Well, we're talking a lot about health, but I think some of the things that are not being discussed, that were being discussed pre-COVID, we were in the midst and still are of a pretty big opioid crisis in this country. 70,000 people died in 2019 from drug overdoses, many of which are driven by opioids. There is a collision of the opioid crisis with the current COVID-19 crisis, and that is also exacerbated by mental health challenges that are comorbid with substance use disorder, and also increasing in prevalence with our social isolation and social distancing and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's a mouthful of saying that it's very complicated. All of these topics are, but I think that that's something we're going to have to think more about as we go forward, and all of these crises are interrelated in very important ways.
Yeah, those opioid numbers are up in Wisconsin, and you know, and I think there's all kinds of social things there. Again, we're not going to know for months to come. It's all going to be fascinating research. You know, we only had an hour for this program, and you know, I hope to be able to revisit and visit again with all of you. I mean, this discussion has really been fascinating, and I think it goes beyond my normal, you know, political analysis stuff. You know, we were able to get deeper into some issues. We didn't get to all the audience questions, but I think audience members, you can find these great faculty members online and send them a question, and maybe they can answer you. But I want to thank certainly all of you, Professor Chinn, Professor Wallace, Professor Nemet, and Professor Durance. And so I also want to thank the audience for coming in and coming on board. You've had some great questions, had some great insight. I want to tell you about some upcoming programs. Tuesday, Milwaukee Election Commission. We're going to talk with somebody from there with the Milwaukee Press Club. October 8th and 9th, that's next week, is the second annual Midwest Polling Summit. October 15th is our discussion with a Democratic and a Republican Senate leader on the top state Senate races, But this has been a great discussion with politics.com and the La Follette School of Public Affairs. I want to thank our sponsors for this event and our Madison series, the Wisconsin Hospital Association, AARP Wisconsin, Xcel Energy, Walmart, American Family Insurance, and Hush Black Oil. So this is Jeff Mayer signing off. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on Tuesday for the discussion with the Milwaukee Election Commission.